There we go. Okay, so basically that was the reason for the no-brainer metrics, is the fact that there's a lot of metrics out there. I spend most of my days doing very complicated measurements and trying to figure out correlations and what's meaningful and everything else. So as I write stuff, I tend to forget that there's still a tremendous need for just simple no-brainer metrics. So that's where we're going. We're going to talk about alternatives to AVEs, alternatives to impressions, alternatives to ROI that are a lot simpler than actually calculating it. Talk a little bit about social, and talk about how to simplify report writing. So let's talk about the AVE stuff. The best approach is, in my book, is that, and it's interesting, I will actually, okay, something just happened. I know what it is. Okay, is that we've had long conversations, subscriber to the newsletter, up in Canada, and she was asked by her boss to pull together AVEs. And she knew it was the wrong thing to do. She did it anyway. She shared the discussion with, shared the process with her boss, at the end of which, and it took her forever and was a tremendous waste of time, at which point her boss tried to present the results and realized it was complete bogus measurement and nobody believed it anyway. And so they are now implementing a media quality score similar to some of the things that I've recommended for a long time to her. What that media quality score is an acceptable proxy. And the reason it's an acceptable proxy, or we can call it an acceptable proxy, is that a media quality score is something that defines what it is in your media coverage that actually moves the needle, that actually moves people closer to consideration. And for this particular client, she knows perfectly well that what she needs in media coverage in order to get people to consider visiting Ontario, which is where it is, she needs desirable photographs, she needs recommendations, she needs something sexy and exciting, like a key message that communicates the unique experience of visiting Ontario. So they have certain things that they know are going to convince people to visit. Those are incorporated into a media quality score, and that is, everybody agrees that if they're in there, then that is an indicator to her boss and senior leadership that people are inclined to visit. So first requirement is you have to align this proxy, whatever it happens to be, to business goals. In many cases, it can be conversions in Google Analytics. It can be anything that people understand is your connection, PR, earned media's connection to the business goal. The most important element to it is that it has to have buy-in from senior leadership. So the first approach I always say is, are we trying to drive traffic to a website? Is there an indicator from Google Analytics that we can use that is an acceptable proxy for interest? I.e., if it's a destination, is it a download of a visitor's guide? If it's donations or volunteers or something, and you serve up a thank you page, can it be the thank you page? For us, it's subscribe page. Maybe it's the download of a white paper. But something along those lines that everybody agrees is an indicator of interest, or perhaps it's filling out a lead form, or providing an email address. Anything like that should be an acceptable alternative, an acceptable proxy for a done metric like AVEs. Now, a little more complicated is if your goal is awareness or consideration or preference. An acceptable proxy might be change in opinion, right? Now, how do you get that? You don't have to do a complicated survey. You can do an NPS score, an NPS like Net Promoter Score like questionnaire on your site or in response to some activity. Or if you're doing events, you set a baseline of awareness, preference, consideration, and then you do something after every event. I have one client that is using trust questionnaires from the Grunig survey to measure trust, and their acceptable alternative is has the needle moved on trust. Another way to look at what AVEs really represented was, even though it didn't actually do it, it compared PR to advertising and showed that PR was cheaper, which leads me to the alternative of, if the goal is to save money, then show you're saving money. Show that you're getting messages across for less money. So what does it cost to buy, to get a message across in terms of a paid tweet versus an earned tweet? What does it cost to get a message across in a blog post versus a doing it through a direct sales call or something else? So look at cost effectiveness metrics for getting your messages across, or cost effectiveness comparisons for touch points, right? So what does it cost to generate engagement via a story or a blog post or a LinkedIn article? What does it cost to reach people, i.e. measure engagements, versus staging an event where your message might get across to 500 people, but it costs $5 million. My favorite analysis is when you look at some of these fairly elaborate events that people stage, and you figure out the cost per actual touch point. And I just did this, I did it for IBM and found out that, frankly, it cost them more to touch people with this event than it would have been to just give them a laptop. Same thing with an employee event I'm studying, which is that, you know, for the cost of getting one person to the event, they could have given everybody a $3,000 raise. Which would the employees prefer? Interesting question. So let's talk about alternatives. So that's alternatives to AVEs, because that's really basically a cost effectiveness measure. For impressions, where we're really trying to talk about reach, the alternatives are literally real engagements, real connections. So when you have email addresses, when you have people liking and following and all those other things, those numbers are going to be smaller. But if you can demonstrate that there's a comment there where somebody actually engaged with you, that's a much better, more valuable connection to than just an impression where you really don't know what's going on. You know, you don't really know that there's an impression being made. Again, my favorite alternative is conversions. Conversions being, you know, what you set up in Google Analytics as a sign, as an indicator of a desirable action. It could just be traffic to a page. Again, it could be your traffic to the thank you page. It could be traffic to some content that you want people to see. It could be engagement in terms of either real engagement like sharing on Facebook or sharing on LinkedIn or retweeting on Twitter. It could be engaging via email. It could be any number of different things. Share of voice is particularly compelling when you're in competitive situations. So if you have a number of different, if you're trying to generate publicity or generate exposure for a product, a brand, or a cause of some sort, demonstrating the fact that you've got a greater desirable share of voice can be very effective. I know that many of the clients I've worked with have substituted impressions and AVEs because, frankly, impressions are so meaningless these days. They're so overinflated and nobody believes them anyway. And what really matters is that you have the opportunity to get in front of more people with your messages than the competition does. That is essentially the goal is to make more noise. If you look at the candidates, you know, how come Trump did so well in the primaries? Because he got more share of voice than everybody else did. And it's important, however, to also look at desirable share of voice because obviously you can generate vast quantities of undesirable share of voice very easily. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the share of desirable voice as a measure. And again, total touch points. As I say, impressions are basically like sperm. There are a lot of them, and very few of them do what you need them to do. So what you want to be showing and measuring is using real touch points, real connections, or something more meaningful like conversions. ROI is a challenge into itself because ROI is very difficult to accurately calculate. It is basically an accounting term. If your accountant wants you to use it, if your chief financial officer is using it, it's an acceptable metric. On the other hand, if you are trying to do a substitute for ROI and you are trying to calculate it, you need to make sure that you know the full return, i.e. what is the revenue that you've generated and what are the all-in costs. And the truth is most ROI is not calculated that way and therefore is wrong and inaccurate. So what you want to be able to do is look at what the return really is. Make sure that everybody has agreed upon what the return is. Make sure that whatever you are counting and measuring and evaluating is something that the leadership perceives as valuable, either revenue, trust, reputation, you know, some form of cost savings, right? So a lower cost per message communicated, a lower cost per lead or per attendee or per action. And once again, going back to Google Analytics, you can put values on your conversions in Google Analytics. We have a whole little video about that. If you want to watch it, Aaron will make sure you get a link to that. But look at the value of the conversions. Look at what it costs to generate them and look at what it costs to convert. Again, an acceptable proxy for bad metrics. For social media, the challenge is really figuring out what you're trying to answer with the data. If there's a metric in your calculation, I know things like Simply Measured and Social Bro and this Breadfast and all of those things. There's a million of them. All of them give you a gazillion different metrics. The reality is, even Hootsuite gives you too many metrics, I think. The reality is what you want is those messages that answer the questions you're trying to ask. So if you're trying to figure out what type of post gets me the most engagement, then you're going to look at engagement per post. If you want to know whether our engagement is going up, you're going to look at the ratio of interactions to the number of posts. So what's the interaction per post over time? If your interaction per post is going up over time, that's a good thing. That's what you want to be measuring. Whatever you do, find a single source of truth and stick to it. The problem is that if you're looking at data from an agency, from Social Bro, from Simply Metrics, from Sprinkler, from whatever, you're going to get all kinds of different calculations because they all calculate things differently. So if you're using Hootsuite, use Hootsuite. If you're using Simply Measured, use Simply Measured. But basically, you want one single source of truth. So that's all about getting the data. Now the question is, how do you simplify report writing? The first thing you need to know is whoever did the work has to be part of the analysis. So if your agency did the work, they need to be there when you're analyzing the results. If it's just you, that's fine. If other people participated, make sure they know that you're doing this analysis so that they can add context to the process. You can't just look at data without context, then it becomes meaningless. Most importantly, this will simplify your life tremendously, is make sure your data is clean before you begin. I've done countless pieces on how to clean your data. It's in, it's in the Measurement Sherpa. It was in our data issue last fall. Data is filthy dirty when it comes in from whatever service you're using. I don't care whether it's Meltwater or Google News or Karma or anybody else. They're all going to have errors in it initially. There are errors of omission. In other words, they may have missed a publication or they may have missed a date or a story. And there are issues of duplication, and there are errors of just wrong searches. And they're going to happen. They're ugly. But whatever you do, you don't want to start analyzing anything until you know that your data is clean and that the coding is accurate. So that means 2 to 3 weeks before your report is due, you're going to dig into the data. Do not wait until 2 or 3 days before your report is due, because if there's errors, it's too late to fix them. And then everybody gets annoyed because you've missed your deadline. 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time, you start analyzing the data, you go through it, you look for, the first thing I do is check and make sure every key publication is in there. Next thing I do is look for duplicates, sort everything by publication, date, and subject in Excel, and you can pretty much figure out where the duplicates are. Then you want to make sure that if it's coded, if there's human coding, even or computer coding, is it consistent, right? So again, in Excel, you can sort your data by subject or the title of the story. So let's say the story is about a major event, beach concerts in Atlantic City. And so you're going to look for, you can even go into Excel and filter for beach. So you're going to look at all of those stories. And then you're going to go look at the sentiment and how it's been coded. If they're all negative and you got 3 or 4 that's positive, check them out. Make sure that something didn't go wrong. Same thing is true on the other side. If everything is wildly positive and you've got a bunch of negatives, check and make sure, are they outliers or were they missed or were they coded wrong? You need 2 or 3 weeks of cleaning to find these things, fix them, get them back. Then the next thing you're going to do is decide your criteria. It might be your quality score, it might be your trust score, it might be whatever it is. But rank order everything based on worst performing to best performing. That immediately is going to give you your first conclusion, which is XYZ ranked best, you know, performed best over all the other things we tried, and XYZ performed worse, and oh, by the way, we won't do that one again. So rank order, force rank everything from best performing to worst performing. Then factor in the costs. It's one thing to say that, you know, this event in Madison Square Garden did best, but that only did best in terms of total reach. What about the cost effectiveness of it? Make sure that you've got factored in the costs and the resources of some of these things, because otherwise it's going to be, people will look at your data and go, well, duh, you know, you spent $5 million on it. It better be on the most successful part of the report. Report as often as you need to make better decisions. Do not, I don't care what anybody tells you to report, you should have good, fresh, clean data in hand whenever you need a report, whenever you need data to make decisions. So I have clients all the time who say, oh, really, I want a quarterly report. Well, no, they don't, because they're going to call me up at the end of the quarter or the end of the month, or in the middle of the month, or in the middle of the week, and say, I have a meeting, I need a decision, tell me this answer. So you need to make sure that your reporting is done when you need data, not long before or long after. So just to give you a sense of, this is my favorite AVE alternative one, is, in, if you've been on these calls before, you've heard the story. Atlantic City, New Jersey, right? They were doing massive amounts of paid advertising, getting a ton of publicity, most of it bad. We had agreed that the acceptable proxy would be visits to the website under the downloads of the travel guide, right? So we tracked that. We developed a conversion in Google, and we showed that, in fact, conversions went up every time the quality scores went up. So there was a direct correlation between the quality score and conversions, less so for just general PR. So we were able to basically say that the contribution of the marketing arm, ACA, generated more conversions by a significant number. For the National Corporation for Community Service, which is the volunteer arm of the White House, they wanted to know which of the various events that they promoted scored best in terms of generating volunteers. So again, what we did in this case was to look at each event, and I tried to get that out of the way, and there it went. Look at each event and look at which was the highest correlation to volunteers, and it was clearly Martin Luther King Day. The ones at the bottom, and this report clearly looks at, oh, well, that one did very, very well. The ones where there was no correlation to increased volunteers, Senior Corps and Learn and Serve, interesting, turns out that those were promoted primarily through social media. Why didn't they work? Maybe because there weren't that many senior people who was designed to get volunteers. That group was designed to be volunteers. The effort was designed to get more seniors to volunteer. They're not on social media, or they weren't on the social media outlets that they were being used. So again, this is the alternative to AVE that we came up with for Atlantic City, and as you can see, we're able to use that media quality score to say that without the contribution of ACA, scores would have been significantly lower. So what? If scores are lower, there's going to be less conversions, fewer people visiting the site. Again, the same thing with using a quality score, but factoring in resource use. And so what we looked at, the size of the box indicates the reach. The vertical is quality of the story and the covering specific events. Resources was the amount of money. So you can look at this chart and say, okay, those things in the upper left-hand corner were very, very successful. The ones in the lower right were not. Let's look at those things in the lower right and figure out whether we want to do them some more, and whether they are, do they need more, can we do them with fewer resources because they took the most resources and got the worst results. So other things that you need as part of this process is you need benchmarks, right? Now, in an ideal world, you do a massive survey or go back a year or at least. In reality, just take the last 3 months worth of data. The world changes so much, you can get away with 3 months worth of data as your benchmark. Does your dashboard need to be this complicated? No. You can basically look at, of all of those things, what are the ones where you really need to make decisions, and only put those charts on there that are, mission critical, decision critical right now. So start with benchmarks, figure out whether you're going to report, the frequency, but also the nature of the report. I have been asked numerous times to use standard corporate PowerPoint templates, I violate them all over the place, because what I find is people want information in a succinct way. If I do a full sentence with certainly more than normal characters as the headline of the slide, people love it because it tells them immediately what it is that they need to know. Timing, again, work backwards from when you need the data. Work way backwards if it's a real decision, if it's a real critical meeting. You need to make sure that that's all set to go. So make sure it's improving your decision-making process. The more you use your data, the more likelihood it will be for you to get more funding in the future, both for your PR programs, but also for your data programs, for your data analysis and reporting. The more you can show that you're making decisions with data and it's helping, the more likely they will be to fund the program going forward. And that's it. And as always, we're halfway through our session, and now we'll take questions. I need to put this
All right. So everyone, feel free to unmute yourself right now. I'm going to start off with a question that was emailed to Katie, and here it is. Question is, what is the best way to measure a message? What are the parameters needed in the analysis, and what is the best way to calculate a message score?
Well, the best way to measure message penetration is to ask people, right? To what extent do you agree with this statement, and the statement represents the message. In fact, I'm just crafting a survey to do that right now in the wake of an event. So the client wanted to know, did I get my messages across the event? I am asking everybody who went to the event on a scale of 1 to 5. Actually, I think I'm using 1 to 7. With 1 being totally disagree, with 7 being completely agree, to what extent you agree with these statements. And those statements represent the messages. That is the very best way to measure message penetration. If you are looking at message appearance in media coverage, right, we're not talking about whether it actually got into anybody's head, whether you're changing anybody's beliefs, but to measure whether it actually appeared and whether it had the opportunity to be seen, that requires a coding sheet and a fairly detailed one. I think, perhaps, maybe, show you what one might look like, maybe. Okay, so this is, no, that's not it. Sorry, I'm going to show you basically what you need is coding instructions that are very, very, very sophisticated. We are in the process of testing some coding instructions now, and it's tough. So this is their media quality index, population, time frame, sentiment, visuals, message content. So in this case, this particular example here, where we're analyzing for Southwest key messages in social media, right? Southwest is a preferred and trusted brands, transparency, hospitality, reliability. And that's all we told them the first time. Nobody got it right. There was no consistency in how that was coded. What we had to do is go back, take those messages, deconstruct them, show them examples, show them what it was like. So for instance, reliability meant plane arrived on time, plane arrived early. The opposite of that is, you know, my plane was delayed, delay. any one of those things, you have to really flesh out and imagine how many different ways that can be talked about. And you need to sometimes test and retest to make sure that whoever, if you're using human coding, are they getting it right? If you're analyzing messages with the computer is almost impossible. You'll never get nuance and you'll never get the gist of things. If your message is something like, you know, United makes airplanes, then you can probably find that on a computer. But if it's more subtle or it's nuanced, you really cannot do anything other than get trained human beings to code it. And that coding sheet has to be very specific and much more detailed than this.
Great. Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
To be determined.
Okay. Let us know if it didn't. I'm happy to elaborate some more.
All right, and now I encourage anyone who's on the call, whether they're using their computer or their phone, to just have at it, you know. If you have a question, now's the time.
And it doesn't have to be about no-brainer metrics. It doesn't have to be about anything in particular. It's just any question that you might happen to have. That's the whole point. I know that we've got a number of new people on the call this time, which is great. And I encourage you to, you know, come up with any possible question you you can possibly think of.
Hi, Katie. I had a quick question about the quadrant you had on one of the last slides in your presentation.
Yes.
I really liked the visual quality of it, but I was wondering, how do you measure that level of engagement? Does that correspond with the media quality score, kind of like the 0 to 10 or negative 10 to 0, or do you calculate that in a different way, looking at you know, the different things you talked about as an alternative to impressions, social shares?
It can be here's the scary concept. It can be anything you want. This is the simplest chart in the world and very complex data behind it. So that the vertical column, in this case, it's the kick butt index, aka the media quality score. Everybody agreed that media quality was the thing that drove traffic to the website, so therefore it was going to be tracked. We calculated the media quality for everything. And then we force ranked, this is the important piece, on that horizontal score, we force ranked all of the programs based on the resource use. We're not talking just budget. We're talking, you know, is it a pain in the ass or is it easy peasy? Did it take everybody in the entire department 24 hours and sleeping on the floor and everything else to get it done, or was it relatively easy? So I don't really care about the budget numbers so much for the horizontal scale, but I want everybody to rank them on a scale of 10 being highest resource use, 1 is assuming that there are 10 programs here. Actually, in this case, there are 8. So we rank 8 programs on a scale of 10 being pain in the ass to 1 being easy peasy, and then you put them in the quadrants that way. You should say, okay, this is high, this is low. You can make as long as that's how you will always do your horizontal access there. Your horizontal data will always be resource use. The vertical can vary. It could be engagement if that's what the goal is. It could be media quality score if that's what your goal is. It can be a trust score if that's what your goal is. As I said, I have this one client who's using a set of trust questionnaires to ask everybody who attends all of their events, and they do many, 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 many events. They ask them these 4 trust questions. They aggregate them into a trust index, and every single event has a ranking in terms of their trust index. So they appear on a table like this based on resource use and trust index. Does that help explain it a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
All right, and I have another question for you, Katie. Do you see it?
Yep.
It's from Phil, and he says, Katie, can you talk about some of the interesting things that you are encountering in your recent work?
Yes. The most interesting thing, which actually did not work, but we're working on trying to figure out why, but I did a correlation between, two correlations. One was looking at the interaction between external and internal sentiment. We have a client that keeps very good track of all the comments, and they get lots and lots and lots of them on their internal blog. They use those comments on the internal blog as an indicator of employee sentiment. And what we did was we analyzed employee sentiment versus external media covered sentiment. Absolutely zero correlation whatsoever. Turns out that employee sentiment is driven by internal decisions. External employee sentiment is driven by things completely unrelated to what the employees are concerned about. So that was the most interesting thing that I've done lately, where it really didn't come out the way I thought it would. Another one that's very interesting is we do a ongoing media analysis for a television network, and we are analyzing the quality score for that relative to ratings and engagement. Now, it turns out that during one period, there was a very, very high correlation between the rating score, the quality score and ratings. And during a different period, it was higher with engagement. So now we're trying to untangle why the quality score would drive engagement one period and ratings the next period. But using multiple data streams, and it's funny, I'm also working on a presentation for tomorrow about the latest trends in measurement, and this is the thing that is the most exciting thing, is that increasingly you're being able to braid together data from conversions and real outcomes to media, to earn media coverage and earn media quality. So that's the most interesting thing. Let me think if there's other things that are exciting. A lot of what we're seeing also is issue tracking. So what's the timing of issue coverage? So for instance, we initiated a survey probably late last fall sometime to indicate awareness of a particular issue in American life. This happened to be our extraordinary high rate of infant mortality. And so our survey just looked for awareness of it, and awareness was relatively low. And we segmented by certain geographic areas and demographics and things like that, and it's very interesting that of late I've started to see increasing mentions of infant mortality, and the study that not our study, but a different study that they did, that was about a 6-month lag, which was interesting. I would have expected the PR initiative to have a faster uptake, and it actually took a good 6 months to get any coverage of it. So that was the interesting piece.
All right.
So Phil, is there anything interesting that you want us to track or to talk about?
There we go. No, thank you. I appreciate it. No, I'm just interested to hear what, from your high level, looking out over the field, what it looks like is moving around.
That's what's. I mean, so the other big, the big new development, AMEC came out with a new measurement framework this past week. It looks very familiar to everybody on this call who's been here before, because it looks very much like mine. It's a little more complicated than I like it to be, but it basically looks at the variables. It's my 6 steps: the variables, the looking at activities and then looking at activity metrics versus outcome metrics. I think the industry is, if anything, sort of consolidating around a certain set of language in terms of outcome metrics and activity metrics. That's sort of that's what's going on in the industry.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, and I have another question for you, Katie.
Yep.
It's from Trisha, and she says, any thoughts on how to best track the impact of an event when you cannot survey attendees post-event? For example, she says, e.g., an ongoing consumer event where emails are not collected.
I guess the point is there a hashtag for the event? Because if you have a hashtag for the event, you can look at your share of hashtag, or you can analyze discussion around the event for sentiment and tone and subject and issue. That might be possible. I've never met an event where you couldn't collect it. I mean, in other words, what I've done is done contests, essentially, in exchange, and gotten people to enter in exchange for email addresses. So I've always forced my clients to collect email addresses so that we could, in fact, do some kind of a follow-up survey. If you really can't collect email addresses at all, how would you measure the impact? The impact, oh, well, again, if you're not collecting them, are you collecting leads at the event? Could you collect leads at the event? Could you collect names in exchange for certain things? Other than that, and timing, I mean, the truth is the fact that if the event happens in isolation from other promotional things, you could track inquiries, you could track traffic on the website. If there is a event website, you could certainly use conversions on that website to look at, did it have any impact? You know, see if did engagement levels spike around the time of the event? And you can certainly look at share of coverage, share of earned media coverage at the event. You can look at coverage and whether it contains your key messages. It may not be huge, but at least you would know, you know, share of conversation around the event. That might be some of the ways that I would look at it. But mostly I'd say collect email addresses, figure out a way to collect email addresses.
Thanks, that was helpful.
Right. Thoughts about big data, current developments. I think the errors in big data are becoming more obvious. You know, people I think are beginning to realize that big data is flawed and is complicated and needs to be cleaned and validated. And I guess that would be the biggest one. I mean, I think big data is flowing in at an incredibly rapid rate, and they're finding out some great things in terms of the analysis of it, but it really does require a very sophisticated level of analysis, and I don't trust it in the hands of anybody other than somebody who really understands how to analyze big data, because I think that's where, you know, all kinds of things go wrong. And if you just, it's the old example of Walmart looking at its data and saying, well, on a revenue per SKU basis, we're going to take all of these things off the shelf. Well, consequently, the store traffic dropped by 10% everywhere they did that, right? What they didn't understand was that when people walked into the store for those items, they also bought other things. Whole Foods did an analysis and figured out that they were going to drop, you know, why do we stock capers, right? Nobody buys capers, there's no profit in them, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out that when those guys were smart and they analyzed the data further, and they realized that everybody who bought capers also bought smoked salmon, which was a very high profit item. So you need somebody, you need context. And I would say, if anything, the trend is an acknowledgement of the fact that you really do need human beings to be there when you're analyzing data. You can't just trust a computer. But they're certainly getting more of it, and it's certainly going to be more interesting. Bill, is there any particular aspect of big data you're interested in these days?
No, the university did a major all-day seminar in the business school not so long ago, where they brought in all kinds of people to talk about big data, and the university is doing a data science certificate now program too. So it's ramping up its presence, and I think I've been, at least I thought I'd been hearing that the streams were becoming more useful.
Yeah, they're being analyzed for more useful things. One of the speakers at this year's summit has been mining data for attitudes, and you know, it still has the limitations of, you know, it's social media, it's only people who are on social media, it's only the data that you can get your hands on. But if there's enough of it, you can use it to predict, you know, intent to purchase. You can use it to, you can use, you know, detailed sort of concept analysis in social media. You can use it to identify attitudes and shifts in behavior. I mean, I think that the challenge in all of this stuff is that it's all subject to hijack, right? So now there's in the media world, there's a move afoot to sort of mine comments in response to stories in social media. Well, we all know that those are crazy. You know, they're kind of wackadoodle stuff. They believe that there's enough data there to mine. I would argue that people who comment at length and frequently in terms of a particular blog post, which may have been written in response to a media event, they're not necessarily representative of the American people, and I think that's a problem. I think people start to assume that things are true when, in fact, it's just a series of comments.
Right. Thanks.
Oh, and one more thing, Katie, this is just kind of a question that I've been getting a lot of. Can you kind of talk about the summit you just mentioned?
Yes. So for those of you who don't know, haven't heard the news, there's every fall for the last 15 years, there's been a summit on the future of measurement right here, actually. If I was very good, I could probably, I'm not sure I can do this, but I can try. Hang on a second, I don't need these headphones. And I can unplug myself, and I will show you my living room. And this relatively comfortable living room. Got it? See that? Isn't that lovely? That fills up with 65 people or 50 people. Every fall, and we discuss the future of measurement. And this year it's being organized. Philip, you'll be very happy to know that there's an entire panel just on internal communications.
Oh, nice.
And the interaction, but mostly on internal. There is a panel on showing business value. There is a panel on when media isn't the goal, i.e. in public affairs, when it's really more about lobbying and swaying opinion. There's the whole next day. It's on the 13th and 14th. The 14th is devoted entirely to social media. 12th is all other forms of media. There's a cocktail party when you get there, and there's a big lobster and clam bake dinner. Philip's been there; he can tell you. And Jan's been there too as well. So it happens in the fall, and it's limited to 50 people. We give subscribers a first shot at it because we know that you're the most interested in it. If you go to our website and click on the Summit on the Future of Measurement button at the top, you can get the full range of speakers and everything else. So we encourage you to come. It's a wonderful chance to share measurement stories with your peers. We will have there Mary Miller, formerly of AbbVie, who's doing some very interesting things with internal communications. Sean Williams, who's writing the standards for internal communications. Sharon McIntosh, who did the standards for, the internal communications measurement program, instigated it at PepsiCo. We have Sean Minogue, who's from the Air Force, speaking about his measurement experiences. Diane Lennox, who's probably been at measurement almost as long as I have, I think. She works for SAS. SAS actually has a measurement program, software platform, but she prefers to use human sentiment analysis. Who else am I missing? Oh, and Cindy Villafranca from Southwest Airlines will be there talking about her dashboard program. So there's going to be a whole session just on measurement dashboards. So we encourage you to sign up. Go to the Summit on the Future of Measurement on our website, and come join us. It's a lot of fun.
All right, I believe that's time unless anyone has a final question they would want to ask Katie. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Well, thank everybody for participating, and we'll catch you next month.
All right, thank you everyone. Have a nice day.